At my grandmother's will reading, my parents expected the oceanfront inn, my golden boy cousin expected a fortune, and I was left a single dusty plastic box from the back of her closet, labeled misc. In that moment, everyone thought I'd just inherited junk. The day my grandmother's will was read, the air in the lawyer's office tasted like dust and old coffee. I remember staring at the blinds, at how one of the plastic slats was bent just slightly, and thinking that if I focused on that instead of on my parents' tight faces, maybe my heart would stop pounding so hard. My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 32 years old, and up until that afternoon, I thought I understood exactly where I stood in my family. In the Hayes family, worth was measured by two things: property and performance. My parents, Mark and Linda, liked to remind everyone that they had both. The Hayes Inn, our family jewel, sat on a stretch of oceanfront land my grandfather had bought 50 years ago, back when nobody wanted to build that close to the cliffs. When I was a kid, the place smelled like wood polish and salt air and my grandmother's cinnamon rolls. By the time I hit high school, it smelled like money. Weddings every weekend, summer tourists packed into every room, a restaurant with a months-long wait list. The inn paid for my private school, my cousin Tyler's Ivy League degree, my parents' Mercedes, Tyler's Tesla, and the never-ending stream of networking dinners they threw for local politicians and business owners. There was one thing they didn't say out loud, but everyone understood. Without my grandmother, nothing in that world existed. Grandma Ruth was the one who had worked double shifts at the diner after Grandpa died, the one who had learned marketing from library books, who had convinced a skeptical bank to finance the first expansion. She was the one who still walked the halls at dawn with a cup of coffee, straightening a frame here, adjusting a plant there, long after my parents started treating the place like their personal stage. To everyone else, she was Mrs. Hayes, the owner. To me, she was the only person in that family who ever asked, "Are you happy?" and actually waited for an answer. When I dropped out of law school at 24, my father refused to look at me for 3 days. My mother said, "How do you think this makes us look?" in a whisper so sharp it sliced right through me. Tyler, golden boy of the family, joked loudly to anyone who'd listen that I couldn't handle real work. Grandma Ruth just patted the couch beside her, handed me a mug of tea, and said, "You look like you can finally breathe, Danny. That has to mean something." She was the one who slipped me the money for my first month's rent when I moved into a shoebox apartment across town. The one who came to eat at the food truck where I ended up working as a line cook, even when my father muttered that it was embarrassing for people to see the Hayes matriarch waiting in line for tacos. "Food is food," she'd say, biting into whatever special I'd put on the board. "And your sauce is better than half the stuff I serve at the inn." So when she collapsed in the rose garden behind the Hayes Inn one gray October morning, pruning shears still clutched in her hand, something fundamental in me went with her. The call came from my mother, voice clipped and too bright. "Daniel, your grandmother passed. The funeral is Friday. Don't be late." That was it. No wobble in her voice. No, "Are you okay?" Just another item on a to-do list. The funeral was a blur of black coats and white flowers and people I'd only ever seen at Christmas parties. My parents worked the room like it was one of their networking events, shaking hands, thanking people for coming. Tyler stood beside them, looking appropriately somber, his hand resting possessively on the podium when he gave a speech about legacy and our family's future. I stood in the back, next to the caterer's table. I kept waiting for someone to mention that Grandma's favorite place in the world wasn't the ballroom or the lobby, but the tiny staff break room where she used to sit with the housekeepers and bellhops and listen to their stories. No one did. When it was over, when the last white rose was laid on the casket, my father put a hand on my shoulder, not to comfort me, but to steer me. "We're going to the lawyers," he said. "Family only. You should be there." I should have known then that nothing about what came next would be fair. The law firm of Price and Tapper sat in a bland building downtown, the kind of place that tried too hard to be comforting with fake plants and beige upholstery. The receptionist gave us that polite, professional smile they all seemed to learn in the first week on the job. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Tyler Hayes, and Mr. Daniel Hayes, she read off the list, only hesitating on my name. My father straightened his tie. My mother smoothed her skirt. Tyler checked his reflection in the dark glass of a framed diploma. I wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans and wished I'd worn a real shirt instead of the same black sweater I'd had on since the funeral. The lawyer, Mr. Tapper, was an older man with a voice like dry paper. He'd known my grandmother for decades, handled every expansion of the Hayes Inn, every refinancing, every partnership agreement. He shook my parents' hands, nodded to Tyler, then looked surprised to see me at all. "Daniel," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Good to see you here." My father's mouth tightened at that, just a little. We sat around an oval conference table, my parents side by side, Tyler beside them. I was on the end, near the door, like an afterthought. A car engine rumbled faintly somewhere outside. The overhead light buzzed. Mr. Tapper cleared his throat. "As you know, Ruth prepared a final will and testament with our office about a year ago. She updated certain provisions 2 months before her passing. I will read it aloud, and then we can address any questions." 2 months. I blinked. 2 months ago, she'd still been walking the halls of the inn, scolding me for not eating enough whenever I stopped by to sneak her a pastry from whichever new place I was working at. 2 months ago, I'd stood with her by the balcony, the ocean mist in our faces, while she said, "You know, Danny, sometimes people forget who really builds things. They get confused about who owns what." "What do you mean?" I'd asked. She just smiled, mysterious. "You'll see one day." At the time, I thought she was teasing me about the way my father kept hinting that Tyler would be taking over the business officially soon. Now my stomach twisted. Mr. Tapper began with the usual preamble, all the legal language about being of sound mind and body. My parents barely listened. They were already half in the future, thinking about numbers, about signatures, about control. Then came the specifics. "To my son, Mark Hayes, and my daughter-in-law, Linda Hayes," Mr. Tapper read, "I leave the contents of my primary checking account at First National Bank, account ending in 2398, currently holding the sum of—" My mother leaned forward, her eyes lighting up. $25,416. There was a pause so small most people would have missed it. My father certainly did. He nodded, as if 25 grand was a nice bonus, nothing more. My mother's face, though, tightened just slightly. 25,000 was not what she'd been expecting. "To my grandson, Tyler Hayes," Mr. Tapper continued, "I leave the antique silver service set that belonged to my mother, stored in the locked cabinet of my dining room, in appreciation of his efforts in representing the Hayes name in academic and social circles." Tyler exhaled in something like relief. "The silver? Really? That's it?" My father shot him a warning look. I sat very still. Grandma had given Tyler the silver in words for years. "You'll get your grandmother's good dishes," she'd said at every holiday, while my mother beamed. Now it was official. "And to my grandson, Daniel Hayes," Mr. Tapper said, glancing at me over the rim of his glasses, "I leave the contents of the blue-lidded storage box at the back of my bedroom closet, labeled misc." Silence. For a beat, I didn't even understand the words. Blue-lidded box. "Misc. That can't be right," my mother said too quickly. "You must have misread." Mr. Tapper checked the paper again. "The language is quite clear, Mrs. Hayes. The blue-lidded storage box at the back of my bedroom closet, labeled misc, to Daniel Hayes with love. It's even in her handwriting on the attached note." He slid the note across the table. There it was, in Grandma's slanted script. "Box for Danny." Heat rose up my neck. I could feel my ears burning. A box of junk? Tyler let out a sharp laugh before catching himself. "Sorry, I mean miscellaneous." My father didn't even bother to pretend. "Ruth always was sentimental," he said, with a strained smile turned in my direction. "I'm sure it's full of old photos and knickknacks. Very meaningful." The way he emphasized meaningful made it sound like a consolation prize at a school raffle. I stared at the note. "Box for Danny." Beside me, my mother gave a little sigh, the sound she made when something didn't live up to her expectations, but she was trying to be gracious about it. "Is that all?" she asked. Mr. Tapper cleared his throat. "There are a few more minor bequests. Donations to the staff fund at the Hayes Inn, a contribution to the local library. Otherwise, yes, that is all." "That can't be all," my father said, the first thread of real irritation weaving into his voice. "What about the inn? The land. You handled all those contracts, Frank. You know how much is tied up in this place. There must be something about formalizing the transfer to us. I felt every muscle in my body go rigid. For as long as I could remember, the Hayes Inn had been the family business in conversation, but everyone behaved like it already belonged to my parents. They made all the decisions. They collected the profits. They signed the checks. When I was 12, I'd asked Grandma, "Is Dad the boss now?" And she'd smiled faintly and said, "He's the manager, honey. There's a difference." I realized now I'd never actually asked who owned it, who owned the land under it. It had always just been ours, in the vaguest possible way. Mr. Tapper shuffled through his papers. "The ownership of the inn is a complex matter," he began carefully. "Ruth's most recent will does not explicitly reassign it. It falls under existing contracts, and that's ridiculous," my mother snapped. "We've been running it for decades. Everyone knows it's ours." "Linda," my father said through gritted teeth, "let the man finish." Mr. Tapper only shook his head. "As I said, we will need to review certain documents in more detail. For today, we are dealing strictly with the contents of the will. I can assure you everything has been executed according to Ruth's last instructions." According to Ruth's last instructions. My mother's painted mouth flattened. Tyler stared at the table. My father's jaw worked like he was grinding down a stone. And me? I just sat there, that slip of paper in my hand, heart pounding so hard it made the world throb at the edges of my vision. My grandma left me a box of junk. That's what everyone in that room heard. A box of old receipts, cheap trinkets, maybe a few faded photos. Something sentimental to keep the family disappointment occupied while the adults discussed real assets. I heard Grandma Ruth's voice instead. "You'll see one day." On the drive back to the inn, no one spoke to me. My parents argued in low, tense voices in the front seats about lawyers and options, and this has to be a misunderstanding. Tyler texted furiously in the back, thumbs flying across the screen, no doubt relaying the juicy details to whatever friends loved to gossip about our dynasty. I stared out the window at the gray ocean, fingers still tingling from where they'd touched Grandma's handwriting. When we pulled into the gravel lot behind the inn, my father turned to me as if he'd just remembered I existed. "You'll go up and get your box," he said, each word carefully neutral. "Then you can head home. We have some things to discuss with Frank later this week." By we, he did not mean me. "Sure," I said dully. "I'll get out of your way." My mother heaved another sigh. "Daniel, don't be so dramatic. Your grandmother wanted you to have something special. That's nice." Tyler snorted softly. I climbed the familiar back stairs to Grandma's room. It was exactly how she'd left it. The floral bedspread smoothed tight, the lace curtains fluttering slightly in the ocean breeze, the framed photos of me and Tyler side by side on the dresser. In his, he was at his high school graduation, cap tossed in the air, my father's arm slung proudly around his shoulders. In mine, I was behind the inn's kitchen on a break, flour on my cheek, holding up a tray of cookies Grandma had sworn were better than the bakery's. "Box for Danny," I murmured. Her closet smelled like cedar and lavender and the faintest hint of her perfume. I pushed aside her neatly hung dresses and coats until my fingers hit something hard and plastic at the back. A blue-lidded storage box. The word misc scribbled on a peeling label in black marker. My chest tightened. I dragged it out, surprised by the weight. It was heavier than it looked, the lid creaking when I pried it open. Inside on top were exactly what everyone would expect. A tangle of old costume jewelry, a cracked snow globe, a stack of faded postcards tied with string, a tin box of buttons, a few yellowing Polaroids. The smell of old paper and dust rose up, making my nose itch. I sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor and started going through it. A brooch shaped like a rose I remembered her wearing when I was small. A playbill from some long-ago show. A photo of my grandfather in front of the inn when it was just a 2-story house with a hand-painted sign. A napkin with a familiar doodle of a seagull on it. She'd drawn that for me 100 times. My chest ached. There was nothing valuable here, not in the way my parents meant. No jewelry case with a secret compartment, no envelope stuffed with cash, just pieces of a life. Near the bottom, my fingers brushed something stiff and heavy, thicker than the photos, wrapped in an old dish towel. For a second I just held it there, feeling my pulse thudding in my fingertips. Then I unwrapped it. What I unfolded wasn't a photo. It was a document. Thick, official paper, edges softened with age. The ink was slightly faded, but the words were still perfectly legible. Across the top, in bold, were three words that made my breath catch in my throat. Title deed, property, and underneath, my own name. Daniel Hayes. The room tilted. I read the description once, then again, the letters swimming. Parcel number, location, boundaries. Coastal property located at 114 Seacliff Road, including all structures and improvements thereon. 114 Seacliff Road, the address of the Hayes Inn. My hands started to shake so hard the paper rattled. Down near the bottom, in Grandma's familiar looping signature, was the date. Signed over 10 years ago. 10 years. While my parents had been running the inn, while Tyler had been bragging about the family hotel, while I'd been standing in this very room telling Grandma about my latest kitchen job, thinking I was the black sheep with nothing to my name, my grandmother had quietly signed the entire property over. To me. I stared at my name on that deed, the legal language swirling around it like a dark tide, and for the first time in my life, I realized that everything I'd been told about who owned what in this family might have been a lie, and that box of junk I was supposed to laugh off, it just turned my entire world upside down. For a long moment, I just knelt there on the carpet, the deed trembling between my fingers, trying to make my brain catch up to what my eyes were seeing. 114 Seacliff Road, all structures and improvements thereon. Owner of record, Daniel Hayes. My name. It has to be some kind of mistake, a small, terrified voice in my head whispered. Maybe it's just a draft. Maybe she never filed it. Then my gaze slid to the bottom. There, clear as day, were the stamps. County recorder, date, instrument number. The ink had bled slightly into the paper fibers, the way official stamps do when they've been pressed down hard. This wasn't a draft. 10 years ago, my grandmother had walked into the county office and put the property, our inn, the land, everything, into my name, and never told me. My heart hammered so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick, like I was breathing through wet cotton. I forced myself to inhale slowly, then again pressing the heel of my hand against my sternum. "Okay," I whispered out loud. "Okay, don't freak out. Just look." I laid the deed gently on the bedspread and went back to the box. Near where the deed had been folded, there was another bundle wrapped in a different dish towel. This one was floral, the fringe frayed. My fingers shook as I unwrapped it. Inside was a stack of papers held together with a paper clip, and on top, a folded letter with my name on it in Grandma Ruth's looping script. Danny. My throat closed. I sat back on my heels, the letter suddenly heavier than anything else in the room. For a second, I just stared at my name, afraid of what opening it would confirm. Then I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded it. "Dear Danny," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer around to sit you down on the couch and say these things to your face, which is a pity, because you always did make the funniest expressions when you were surprised." I let out a half snort, half sob. "I know right now you probably think all you got from me is a box of old junk. Your parents and Tyler definitely think so. Let them. They've spent so many years confusing things with worth that they can't tell the difference anymore." My eyes blurred. I wiped them angrily and kept reading. "I signed the inn over to you 10 years ago. I didn't do it to hurt your father or to spite your mother. I did it because I know them. I've watched the way they talk about this place, about the staff, about you. They stopped seeing it as a home a long time ago. To them, it became a stage and a piggy bank. You, on the other hand, have never once asked me, what do I get? You asked if the dishwasher was okay when his wife got sick. You asked if Mr. Alvarez in maintenance needed a day off when his knee was acting up. You brought the kitchen staff coffee from your cheap little places across town because you said they work harder than anyone. You see the people, not just the numbers. This inn was built on people, Danny, on sweat and backs and late nights. Your grandfather and I scrubbed those floors ourselves when we didn't have money to hire anyone. We took in staff's kids when they had nowhere else to go. We made it a place where tired travelers felt human again, not just processed. I don't trust Mark and Linda to remember that when I'm not here to nag them. I do trust you, so the land and the building are yours. Legally, that's already settled. Frank has all the relevant documents. If he's still alive and not too senile, he'll explain it to you. Don't let your father bully you into thinking you have no rights, because you do. You may not care about rights now, but one day you will need them. Maybe you never want to run the place yourself. That's fine. But I want you to be the one who decides what happens to it, not anybody else. I want you to be able to protect the people who have given their lives to this inn, if it comes to that. And if you decide to sell the whole darn cliff and run off to Spain to become a world-famous chef, well, I suppose you'll have earned that too. Whatever you choose it with your own heart. I'm sorry I didn't tell you this in person. Every time I tried, you were already carrying so much. Disappointing your parents, starting over, trying to figure out who you are outside of what they want. I didn't want this to become another weight. I wanted it to be a gift when you needed it most. If they make you feel small after the will reading, come sit on my bed, open this box, and remember, I never thought you were small, not for a single second. I love you more than all the ocean outside that window. Grandma Ruth. By the time I reached the end, I was shaking. Tears dripped onto the paper, and I swore softly, blotting them with the sleeve of my sweater like a kid who'd spilled juice on a library book. The urge to run downstairs and shove the deed in my parents' faces was white hot. You see this? You see what she thought of you? Of me? But another, quieter part of me, the part that heard Grandma's voice saying, "Choose it with your own heart," made me pause. Not yet. I refolded the letter carefully, slipped it back into its envelope, and tucked it inside my jacket, close to my chest. The deed went into my backpack, sandwiched between the worn notebook I always carried and my wallet. I took photos of both with my phone from every angle, checking them twice, digital copies, just in case. Then I looked back into the box. The stack of papers under the letter were photocopies of things I didn't fully understand at a glance. Old partnership agreements, loan documents, something about management contracts. Names, dates, signatures. My father's signature in particular on a few. One line caught my eye. Mark Hayes, acting in capacity as manager for owner of record Daniel Hayes. Manager, I exhaled slowly. So Grandma had told at least someone. She'd told him. He'd known, for years, that legally he was not the owner, that he was operating as a manager, and he'd let everyone believe otherwise. My stomach rolled. Voices floated faintly up from downstairs. The clatter of dishes, my mother's high-pitched exasperation. I recognized the cadence of one of her rants, even if I couldn't make out the words. I closed the box and put the old knickknacks back on top, arranging them so it looked like nothing had been disturbed. I slid it under my arm. When I stepped into the hallway, the inn felt different. The same faded floral carpet, the same framed photos of sunrises over the ocean, but there was a strange doubling in my perception now. One version of this place was the one I'd grown up in, where my father's voice echoed off the walls, where my mother approved or disapproved of how the staff folded napkins. The other was the version where every square inch of paint, every doorknob, every sheet on every bed was legally mine. Legally mine. I gripped the railing as I started down the stairs, half afraid my legs wouldn't hold me. My parents were in the office off the lobby, door half closed, voices raised just enough that anyone passing by could hear the stress. The front desk clerk, Jenna, sat stiffly at her station, pretending to focus on the computer while obviously listening. "Can't just vanish, Mark," my mother was saying. "If Ruth didn't put the inn in the will, then that idiot lawyer must have screwed something up, or she had another document." "She didn't," my father snapped. "Do you honestly think she wouldn't have told me? I handled every contract for the last decade. It's been implied, in everything." "Implied isn't the same as written," my mother hissed. I stepped into the archway. I got the box. Both their heads whipped around. For a second, my mother's expression softened just a fraction as she took in the actual sight of me, but it hardened just as quickly when her eyes flicked to the plastic bin in my hands. "Well," she said with forced brightness, "what treasures did you get?" Tyler, leaning against a filing cabinet with his arms crossed, smirked. "Did Grandma leave you her collection of broken salt shakers?" My jaw tightened. I shifted my grip on the box, feeling the weight of the empty dish towel folded at the bottom, the hidden absence of what had been there. "Just old stuff," I said, keeping my tone light. Photos, buttons, some postcards. You know, Grandma. My father's shoulders dropped a millimeter. Relief flashed across his face like a shadow. That's nice, he said. Very personal. I'm sure it'll mean a lot to you. Jenna's eyes flicked between us, curiosity plain on her face. I wondered if she knew anything, if Grandma had said anything to her the way she'd said little things to me. I didn't let my gaze linger. I'm gonna head out, I said. Long day. My mother sniffed. You're not staying for dinner? We invited Frank to go over the will again. There must be something missing. I stifled a bitter laugh. Of course they'd invited the lawyer. Of course they thought they could talk him into finding a loophole. Can't, I said. Gotta shift. At that truck? The way my father said it, you'd think I'd said dumpster. Yes, at that truck, I said evenly. People gotta eat. He stared at me, some retort clearly forming on his tongue, but for once he swallowed it. Fine, he said. Go. We'll be in touch. There will be some business things to settle once we've clarified a few points. Business things. I forced my mouth into something that might have been a smile from a distance. Sure, Dad. You know where to find me. Outside, the wind knifed in off the ocean, sharp and clean. I sucked it down like medicine, feeling my lungs clear. I didn't drive straight to my apartment. Instead, after tossing the box carefully into the back seat and checking twice that my backpack was zipped with the deed inside, I made a detour to a squat concrete building downtown with county recorder and assessor stenciled in peeling letters over the door. The woman behind the counter looked up over her glasses. She had a name tag that said Marcia and a mug that said World's Okayest Clerk. Can I help you? She said. I hope so, I said, trying to sound like a guy who did stuff like this all the time. I need to verify a property record and maybe get a certified copy of the deed. She tapped at her keyboard. Parcel number or owner name? I gave her the parcel number from the deed first, just to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. The clack of her keys echoed in my head like a countdown. It went up slightly. You're thorough. We don't get many folks coming in with the parcel number memorized. I gave a weak laugh. I do my homework. Owner of record is, she squinted at the screen, then looked up at me, comparing something in her head. Daniel Hayes, that you? My stomach flipped, but I nodded. Yeah, that's me. She clicked a few more times. Yeah, it's been you for, let's see, 10 years. Title transfer from Ruth Hayes. No subsequent changes recorded. The word no echoed. So nobody else has been added? I asked, just to be absolutely, obsessively sure. Nope, she chewed the end of her pen. We've got a management agreement filed, looks like between you and Mark Hayes, dated the same day as the transfer. That just says he can manage operations on your behalf. But from the county's perspective, you're the owner. My ears rang. Is there a mortgage? I forced myself to ask. Couple, she said. She clicked again, frowning. First one's from about 11 years ago, signed by Ruth, paid off. Then there's a bigger one from 7 years ago. That one's still active, signed by Mark Hayes as, She leaned closer to the monitor, then made an annoyed noise. People really don't know how to fill these dang things out. He put owner under his signature, but the system still shows you as owner of record. Bank probably just went with what he wrote without checking. Wouldn't be the first time. Something cold slid down my spine. My father had signed as owner on a mortgage he legally didn't own. Maybe he'd thought it didn't matter. Maybe he'd assumed Grandma would never contradict whatever narrative he preferred. Now she wasn't here to back him up. Only the records were. Can I get copies of all of that? I asked quietly. The deed, the management agreement, the mortgage docs. Sure thing. Marcia printed out a request form and slid it across. Fill that out. It'll be $10 a document if you want them certified. I filled out the form with a hand that barely seemed attached to my body. When she handed me the stack of papers, 10 minutes later, fat with stamps and signature, it felt like she was passing me something radioactive. Congratulations, she said dryly. You own a very expensive problem, I huffed. You have no idea. On the sidewalk outside, I sat in my car with the engine off, papers spread across my lap. The management agreement was exactly what Marcia had said. Grandma authorizing my father to run the inn, hire and fire staff, handle bookings, all on behalf of Daniel Hayes, owner of record. There was a clause about termination, about how I could revoke it at any time with written notice. The mortgage document was worse, page after page of boilerplate. Then, buried in the middle, my father's neat, confident signature. Mark Hayes, owner. I pictured him sitting at some banker's desk, pen in hand, chest puffed out, talking about my property and my inn. I pictured that same banker not bothering to check the county record because the name Hayes matched, and it was easier not to. Anger flared, brief and hot. He'd built his whole sense of self on something that, on paper at least, wasn't his. And I'd built my whole sense of self on the idea that I had nothing, that I was the screw-up with no stake in anything, the one who'd disappointed everyone, who worked in the shadows of food trucks while my brother cut ribbons. Nothing about this was fair. Not to me, not even to him in a twisted way, and certainly not to Grandma's memory. I needed help. Pulling out my phone, I scrolled past my father's name, past Mom, past Tyler, to the contact I'd saved months ago when I'd Googled real estate attorney near me for a completely different reason and then never called. Law Office of Alice Monroe. My thumb hesitated over the call button for half a second, then pressed. Monroe Law, came a crisp female voice after 2 rings. Hi, I said, realizing belatedly that I probably sounded like a guy who'd just been punched. My name is Daniel Hayes. I recently found out I own a piece of property, and I need to understand what that actually means. There might be some complications. There was a beat of silence. Complications are our specialty, she said dryly. Can you come in tomorrow at 10? I glanced at my mental schedule. Shift at the truck from noon to 8. I could make 10. Yes, I said. Thank you. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time with the phone still in my hand, watching the sun sink behind the concrete parking structure across the street. In the space of a few hours, I had gone from guy whose grandma left him a box of junk to legal owner of the only real asset my family had ever bragged about. My parents were downstairs in the inn's office right now, most likely tearing through files and leaving frantic voicemails for Frank Tapper, convinced there had to be some clause, some line, some oversight that would confirm what they'd always believed. They had no idea the oversight wasn't in the will. It was in the story they'd told themselves for years. That night, back in my tiny apartment, I spread everything out on the kitchen table. The deed, Grandma's letter, the management agreement, the mortgage papers. I read each line until the words stopped making sense, then went back to the letter as a kind of palate cleanser. I didn't do it to hurt your father, she'd written. I did it because I know them. I rubbed my eyes. What was I supposed to do with this? March in and fire my parents, change the locks, report my father for signing as owner on a mortgage? I imagined the faces of the staff, Jenna at the front desk, Alvarez in maintenance, the housekeeping crew that had been there since before I was born, people who relied on those paychecks, people Grandma had loved. Choosing with my own heart meant thinking about them too. Sleep, when it finally came, was a choppy, feverish thing, full of images of the inn collapsing into the sea while my parents stood on the balcony arguing about whose name was on the sign. The next morning, Monroe Law was in a brick building that used to be a factory. The waiting room smelled like coffee and printer ink. A plant in the corner drooped in a way that suggested no one had watered it in a while. Alice Monroe turned out to be in her 40s, hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, dark eyes that missed nothing. She shook my hand firmly, then gestured to a chair across from her desk. Daniel Hayes, she said, glancing at the intake form on her screen. You own the Hayes Inn. It wasn't a question. Apparently, I said weakly. I pulled the deed and Grandma's letter from my bag and slid them across. I didn't know until yesterday. She read the deed first, lips pressed together, then the letter. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly at a few lines, then sharpened again when she reached the part about the management agreement. Do you have that? She asked. I handed it over, along with the mortgage papers. She read in silence for a long minute, tapping a pen against the desk, the rhythmic click the only sound in the room. Well, she said finally, looking up, you, Mr. Hayes, are in a mess, but it's a mess where for once the law is on your side. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. So it's real, I said. I mean, I know the county clerk confirmed it, but you needed to hear it from someone who bills by the hour, she said dryly. Yes, it's real. Your grandmother did a proper title transfer. She recorded it. She executed a management agreement putting your father in charge while she was alive and while you were, presumably, not interested in running a hotel. That's accurate, I said. She did not give him ownership. And this, she tapped the mortgage document, is him either misunderstanding that or willfully ignoring it. The bank should have checked the county records. They didn't. That's on them. But if push comes to shove, there's an argument to be made that he misrepresented himself. I swallowed. Could he go to jail? Let's not jump there yet, she said calmly. Right now, the important thing is that if you choose to, you can revoke the management agreement and take control. You can also demand an accounting. An accounting? A detailed report of how the inn's profits have been used while your father's been managing it. Salaries, improvements, personal expenses run through the business. If he's been treating it like his personal piggy bank, as your grandmother seems to suspect, that's going to show. I pictured my mother's designer handbags, the endless business dinners, the renovations to their private wing of the inn, the way they'd always said, the inn pays for itself, like that was proof of their genius. What happens if I revoke the agreement? I asked. You become the boss, she said simply. Legally. You can keep your parents on in some capacity, fire them, bring in a professional manager, sell the property, whatever you choose. But Daniel, she leaned forward slightly. Whatever you do, you need to document everything. Don't have a single conversation with them about this alone if you can help it. Don't sign anything they give you without me looking at it. And don't let them bully you into doing the right thing for the family if that right thing is handing them back control without protections. I managed a humorless laugh. You've met people like my parents before. I've met people like your parents every week for 20 years, she said. They're not evil. They're just used to getting their way. People like your grandmother are rare. She thought 10 steps ahead. She gave you the tools. Now you need to decide how you're going to use them. Use them. As I walked back out into the bright, cold morning, her words lingered. For 32 years, my life had been shaped by what other people thought I should be. A good son, a future executive, a disappointment, an embarrassment. Grandma was the only one who'd ever said, "What do you want?" Now she'd given me the ultimate question in paper form. What did I want to happen to the Hayes Inn? As I drove toward my shift at the food truck, the inn's silhouette loomed in my mind like a ship on a foggy horizon. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from an unknown number popped up. Frank Tapper. Daniel, your father has asked me to set up a meeting regarding clarifying Ruth's intentions. I think it would be wise for you to be present. Tomorrow, 3 p.m., my office. I stared at the screen, clarifying Ruth's intentions. I heard her voice again in my head. Let them think it's junk. Tomorrow, in that same beige room where they'd barely listened to the will, my parents were going to try to bend the story back into something that made sense to them. For the first time in my life, I'd be walking into the conversation with more than just my hurt. I'd be walking in with the truth. The next day, when I walked back into Frank Tapper's office, it didn't feel like the same room. Same beige walls, same crooked blind, same smell of old coffee. But last time I'd come in here as the family disappointment tagging along for the show. This time, I knew I was the one holding the script. My parents were already there, sitting side by side at the conference table. My mother's lips were pressed so tight they'd nearly disappeared. My father's jaw was clenched, one thumb rubbing compulsively over his wedding band. Tyler sat a little off to the side, legs sprawled, phone in hand, the picture of casual boredom. Frank stood when I entered. Daniel, thank you for coming. My father didn't bother to hide his annoyance. We weren't sure you'd make it, he said. Figured you'd have work. At the truck, Tyler muttered under his breath. I pretended not to hear either of them. Instead, I stepped aside to let the woman behind me through the doorway. Alice Monroe. She wore the same gray suit from the day before, hair in that severe bun, briefcase in one hand. If she was at all amused by the way 3 sets of haze eyes snapped to her, she didn't show it. This is Alice, I said, taking the seat opposite my parents. My attorney. My mother's eyebrows shot up. Your attorney? Daniel, that seems unnecessary. My father's expression darkened. We're having a family conversation, he said, a warning edge in his tone. We don't need outside interference. We're also talking about legal rights and obligations, Alice said mildly, setting her briefcase down and taking the chair next to me, which is very much my business. Frank, to his credit, didn't look surprised. If anything, there was a flicker of relief. "Let's all sit," he said. "There's a lot to go over." My heart was thudding, but my hands were steady as I unzipped my backpack. The feel of the paper under my fingertips was like a grounding wire. My father leaned forward. "Frank, we've spoken at length since the will reading," he began, slipping into his boardroom voice. "You and Ruth handled the inn's contracts for years. Obviously, she intended for the property to eventually pass to us. The will just overlooked the technicalities. We need to correct that." "Clarify," my mother added quickly. "We need to clarify her intentions. That's what this is about." Frank folded his hands on the table. He looked older today than he had 2 days ago, the lines around his mouth deeper. "Mark," he said slowly, "before we discuss intentions, we need to discuss facts. There is something I should have brought up at the will reading, but Ruth specifically asked me not to. She wanted Daniel to discover it in his own time." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Is this about the box of junk again?" Alice's gaze sharpened, but she said nothing. Frank glanced at me. "Daniel, did you find anything in that box?" I exhaled. This was the moment. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "I found this." I pulled out the deed and slid it across the table, face up. The room went quiet. For a second, no one moved. Then my father snatched it up, eyes scanning the page. I watched the color drain from his face, a slow tide going out. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth. Tyler sat forward, brow furrowing. "What is it?" he demanded. "What?" "It's a joke," my father said abruptly, voice too loud in the small room. His hand shook as he thrust the paper back toward Frank. "Tell him, Frank. This is clearly some kind of placeholder, or a copy error. Ruth would never." Frank didn't take it right away. He looked at my father with something like pity. "It's not a joke, Mark," he said quietly. "It's a recorded title deed. Ruth transferred ownership of the property at 114 Seacliff Road to Daniel 10 years ago. I handled the filing myself." My father froze. "What?" Tyler said, voice cracking. "That's impossible." My mother's eyes were wild. "That can't be legal," she hissed. "She can't just secretly give the inn away. We've been running it. Everyone assumes." "Assumptions," Alice said, speaking for the first time, "are not legally binding." She opened her briefcase and pulled out the certified copies Marcia had given us. "These are records from the county recorder's office confirming the transfer and Daniel's status as owner of record. There is also a management agreement." She slid another document forward, naming Mark Hayes as manager on Daniel's behalf. My father stared at the management agreement like he'd never seen it before. But I'd seen his signature on it, clear as day. Ruth and I discussed an arrangement," he said slowly, grasping for purchase. "It was supposed to be temporary, a way to keep Daniel included. It was symbolic." "It was recorded," Alice said evenly, "which makes it rather more than symbolic." Silence fell again, thick and heavy. I watched a dozen emotions flicker across my parents' faces. Denial, confusion, a flash of hurt, and underneath all of it, a raw, naked fear. Tyler looked between us, shock hardening into something uglier. "So what? Grandma just hands everything to him?" he snapped, jabbing a finger in my direction. "The guy who couldn't even finish law school? The one who ran off to flip burgers and abandoned the family business? That's insane." Heat flared in my chest. "I didn't abandon anything," I said, keeping my voice low. "I was never invited in." "You chose to leave," my mother shot back. "You chose this life. We are the ones who stayed, who worked, who kept the inn going." Alice shifted slightly. "I'm sure you did a lot of work," she said, "and I'm not here to devalue that, but the question on the table is not who worked the most. It's who owns the land and the building. Legally, that's Daniel." My father slammed his palm on the table. The sound made me jump. "You expect me to believe that Ruth would cut us out?" he roared, voice cracking on the last word. "After everything I've done? After building that place with her for 30 years? Frank's mouth tightened. "She didn't cut you out, Mark," he said quietly. "She trusted you to manage the inn until Daniel was ready. She trusted you to remember that you were a manager, not an owner." "And when exactly was he supposed to be ready?" my mother demanded, turning on him. When he stopped running off to dirty kitchens and finally put on a real suit, we've been waiting for that day for a decade. I don't think you ever asked me what I wanted, I said. The words surprised even me. They hung there in the air, solid and undeniable. My mother blinked, as if I'd spoken in another language. "This is ridiculous," Tyler muttered. He snatched up the deed again and flipped through it like he could change the words by sheer force of will. "It has to be challenged. We can contest it. Right, Dad? We'll take it to court. Tell the judge she was senile or something." "Careful," Alice said softly. "You're talking about asking a court to declare your grandmother incompetent 10 years before she died. That will call every other document she signed into question, including your father's mortgages." My father went still. Frank cleared his throat. "She was not incompetent," he said firmly. "Ruth was sharper at 80 than most people at 50. She knew exactly what she was doing." I thought of her letter, of the way she'd written. I thought 10 steps ahead. What does this mean?" my mother whispered finally, her voice raw. "Practically, for us." Alice laced her fingers together on the table. "In practical terms," she said, "it means Daniel is the legal owner. He can choose to maintain the current management arrangement, revoke it entirely, or renegotiate it. He can request a full accounting of the inn's finances for as long as Mark has been managing it. If he finds misuse of funds, he could pursue civil remedies, potentially criminal ones, if any misrepresentations were made to banks or the tax authorities." My father flinched. I pictured the mortgage again, his signature above the word owner. "Now," Alice continued, pivoting slightly, "I'm not saying that's the path we want to go down. My client has not expressed any desire to see his parents in court, but he does want to understand what's been happening with his property." 3 sets of eyes swung toward me. My mouth was dry. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my ribs. This was the choice Grandma had given me. Use it how you choose. "I don't want to destroy the inn," I said, forcing the words out one at a time. "Or you. That's not what this is about. But I'm not going to pretend this isn't real either." I looked at my father. "You knew, Dad," I said quietly. "You signed that management agreement. You knew, at least on some level, that I was the owner. You never told me. You never even hinted." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That tiny silence was louder than any shout. "It was complicated," he rasped finally. "You were lost. Ruth insisted on that paperwork as some kind of safety net for you. I didn't want to burden you, and frankly, I didn't think it would ever be relevant. We were running the inn. You weren't interested." "You didn't ask if I was interested," I said. "You just assumed I wasn't because I didn't want to do it your way." My mother's eyes flashed. "You wanted to play kitchen," she said. "That's not the same as running a business." "Maybe not," I said. "But Grandma seemed to think I could grow into it. She gave me time. You gave up on me the second I didn't fit your picture." The words landed like stones in a still pond. Tyler shifted uneasily. For a moment, some defensive retort flickered in my mother's eyes, but it died before it reached her mouth. "So what now?" she asked hoarsely. "You fire us? Kick us out of our own home?" "Our home," I echoed softly. "That's interesting. Ask any of the staff whose home it felt like the last 10 years. Her face flushed. Alice cleared her throat. "We're not here to decide every detail today," she said. "We're here to make a start. Daniel?" I swallowed. "I want an accounting," I said. "Full financial records for the last 10 years. I want to see where the inn's money has been going. Salaries, repairs, business expenses, all of it. After that, we can decide what the management structure looks like." My father bristled. "You don't trust us." I met his eyes. "You haven't given me a lot of reason to." Frank spoke up before my father could explode again. "Mark," he said gently, "you knew this day might come. Ruth talked to me about it. She hoped you'd accept it with grace. She was—" his voice faltered just slightly, "very clear about her reasons. She loved you, but she also saw you." My father slumped back in his chair, some of the fight draining out of him. For the first time, he looked old. Not in the physical sense, but in the way a man looks when the story he's told himself about his life starts to crack. My mother reached for his hand under the table. He didn't pull away, but he didn't grip back either. "We can have the records sent to Miss Monroe," Frank said. "You still have full access, Mark. You've done nothing that can't be explained, I'm sure." The way he said "I'm sure" made it clear he wasn't, in fact, sure at all. The meeting limped on for another half hour. Practicalities. Deadlines. Alice spelling out in precise, unemotional language what was expected. My parents agreeing through gritted teeth. When it was finally over, when Frank had gathered his papers and Tyler had stalked out without looking at me, my mother hovered by the doorway. "Daniel," she said. I paused, heart twisting. For a second, her face softened. I saw my mother from years ago, the one who used to tuck me into bed before she got so busy managing impressions. Then the hardness crept back in. "I hope you're happy," she said, voice low and brittle. "This victory." The word tasted sour. "I'm not," I said quietly. "Not about this. I wish it didn't have to be a victory at all." She stared at me for a heartbeat, some unreadable emotion flickering behind her eyes, then turned and walked away. Over the next few months, the illusion my parents had built around themselves peeled back layer by layer. The accounting Alice requested came in boxes, literally. Bank statements, receipts, internal reports. Half of it was a mess, shoved into folders with scribbles like misc comp and hospitality. We spread it all out on my kitchen table again, just like I had with Grandma's papers that first night. Only this time, there were spreadsheets. "This is sloppy," Alice said, frowning. "At best. At worst, it was reckless. There were legitimate expenses, of course. Staff salaries, linen services, food suppliers, repairs to the roof, to the boilers, to the ancient elevator that always creaked a little too ominously. And then there were the business dinners that were really weekly feasts at the most expensive restaurant in town. The spa retreat in Napa my parents had labeled conference. The remodel of their private suite, complete with Italian marble and a custom whirlpool tub, booked under guest room upgrade. Technically, a lot of it skirted the line of what could be defended as business-related. Technically. But it told a story that was painfully clear. They had treated the inn as an extension of themselves, as an identity, as proof that they were the kind of people who deserved nice things. The difference was, those nice things had been financed on a property they didn't legally own. "I'm not interested in criminal charges," I told Alice, again and again, whenever her eyes narrowed a little too much at a particularly egregious line item. I want boundaries, and I want the inn to be healthy." She nodded. "Then we use this as leverage. You set terms. They can accept them, or you can revoke the management agreement and bring in professionals. Either way, you're in control." Control. The word still felt foreign on my tongue. The conversation when we finally sat down with my parents again was one of the hardest things I've ever done. We met at the inn this time, in a small back office that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight, slanting through narrow windows. Boxes of old marketing materials cluttered the corners. I laid out the basics. A new management contract, this time with an outside company recommended by Alice. My parents could stay on in advisory roles if they wanted, drawing a fixed salary, not an ever-flexible owner's draw. All personal expenses would be separated from business accounts. Any future renovations would require my approval as owner. I expected shouting, explosions. What I got instead was something worse. Resignation. My father stared at the papers for a long time, then reached for a pen. His hand shook slightly as he signed his name under the words senior consultant. My mother signed too, lips pressed in a thin line. "This is humiliating," she said under her breath. "It's sustainable," I said softly. "For the inn, for everyone who depends on it." She glared at me, but there was no real fire behind it anymore. Just exhaustion. Word got around town, of course. In a place like ours, nothing stays secret for long. People heard that Grandma had left the inn to me. They heard that my parents were no longer the owners. They heard that a professional management company was coming in to modernize operations. Some people whispered that I'd stolen the inn. Others said, well, it was his grandma's right to do what she wanted. A few staff members cornered me in the hallways, nervous. Are we still going to have jobs?" Jenna asked me one night, twisting the hem of her shirt between her fingers. If I have anything to say about it, yes. I said, I can't promise nothing will change, but I can promise you won't be the first people I throw under the bus. She let out a breath, shoulders sagging in relief. You sound like her, she said, like Mrs. Hayes. The words hit me straight in the chest. There were awkward moments, too. Running into old family friends who had always looked through me to my parents. Now they looked at me differently, recalibrating. "So you're the boss now," one of them said at a charity event, clapping me on the back a little too hard. "Who would have thought?" I smiled thinly and thought Grandma would have. Tyler avoided me for weeks, then months. When we finally did cross paths in the inn's lobby after the new management team had started, he could barely meet my eyes. "You happy?" he muttered, not quite looking at me. "You got everything?" "No," I said quietly. "I didn't get her back." He flinched like I'd slapped him. Then he walked away. I didn't follow. A year later, I stood on the same balcony where Grandma and I had watched the sun set 100 times, the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. The inn looked different. The bones were the same white facade, same wraparound porch. But the paint was fresh. The gardens were thriving. The faded furniture in the lobby had been replaced with pieces that actually fit the building's character instead of whatever was on sale that year. The restaurant had a new menu, one I'd helped design with the executive chef. We'd taken some of Grandma's recipes, her cinnamon rolls, her pot roast, and elevated them just enough to make them sing without losing their soul. We'd also added a few of my own dishes. I'd started spending more and more time in the inn's kitchen, then in the front office, then in the manager's meetings. The outside management company handled the day-to-day logistics, but I was there for the big decisions, the ones that shaped what kind of place we wanted to be. It turned out all those years in cramped truck kitchens had taught me more about hospitality than my parents' galas ever had. My parents still lived in their suite on the 3rd floor. They still walked through the lobby like it hurt them to be lesser figures now. But over time, their sharp edges dulled. My father started telling stories to the younger staff about the early days, about how he and Grandma had scrubbed floors and painted walls at midnight. My mother began to spend more time in the garden, hands in the dirt, her designer gloves abandoned in favor of cheap work ones. We were not suddenly a happy, healed family. There were still words between us that would probably never be said, apologies that would remain stuck in throats. But there was a kind of wary truce. And there was the inn, solid, standing, full of people. On the anniversary of Grandma's death, I took the afternoon off and went up to her room. We'd left it mostly untouched. The management company had wanted to turn it into another guest suite at first, but I'd refused. "This room stays," I'd said. "We can call it the Founder's Suite or something if you need a label. But we're not repainting those walls." So her floral bedspread was still there, the lace curtains, the photo of her and Grandpa in front of the inn when it was nothing more than a big house with a dream. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulled her letter from my pocket, it was soft with rereading now, and unfolded it. "You'll see one day," she'd written. "I see it, Grandma," I said quietly, looking around the room. "I really do." Out the window, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, staining the water gold. Somewhere downstairs, someone laughed. A guest's suitcase wheels rattled over the tile. A bellhop called for the elevator. Life went on. "I'm doing my best," I whispered, "to choose with my own heart, to take care of what you built, of the people." The ache of missing her never really went away. It was just a part of me now, like a scar that twinges when it rains. But sitting there, in that room, I didn't feel alone. I felt her hand on my shoulder, warm and steady, the way it had been the day I told her I was dropping out of law school, the way it would have been the day she'd watched me stand up to my parents in Frank's office. "I never thought you were small," she'd written. Neither did I anymore. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the family disappointment lurking at the edges of other people's narratives. I was writing my own. The boy who'd been laughed at for getting just a box of junk had opened it and found not just a deed, but a different way of seeing himself. Not as an afterthought, but as the person his grandmother had trusted most in the world. And that, more than the land, more than the inn, more than any bank statement, was the real inheritance she'd left me.